I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk with you about something that most of the time Americans don't know anything about. I've been in this country since 1983, carrying out programs of all sorts, but most of our travelers have not been. And so in 2019, we decided that this trip should be the trip that we should find out what American citizens who have never been here before think about the cities that are beyond Moscow and St. Petersburg. We hear in our news always about Moscow, 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 sometimes about St. Petersburg. And so these delegates left Moscow on September the 7th, flew to all of these places across several time zones, and landed in the cities where they were to be received without knowledge of who they were going to be meeting, what kind of airport they would be coming into, what kind of schools they would be in, if they would be received in homes or what. And so we didn't hear anything from them until they landed back in St. Petersburg on September the 12th, having had 4.5 to 5 days of meeting with these regional cities that they were assigned to. So you can imagine the excitement when they met each other in the hotels in St. Petersburg, because all of them had had separate experiences, very different experiences, and were eager to talk about them with each other. So the next morning, we arranged to have a large conference room where we all sat in a circle. It was loads of fun. There was a lot of laughter. We were trying to behave because we knew the cameras were on. But nonetheless, all of them told very interesting and very different stories. And we want to share with you what it is that they brought back from these regional cities that are far from Moscow and St. Petersburg. So watch and see for yourself. Now we at least know what's going on in those cities out across the country, that they're not deprived, that they have had a good bit of money spent on them, renovating them, that the streets and the roads for the most part have been rebuilt and repainted, buildings have been reconstructed, business is carrying on as usual. So see for yourself what Russia looks like today. We hope you enjoy it. We sure enjoyed being out there.
One of my favorite moments of the whole trip was I'm explaining our citizen, the CCI model, how we're trying to make a difference, concerned about kind of the threat of nuclear weapons. So at Kazan, it was being treated like really royalty.
We met with the local, so Tatarstan or Kazan is really basically half Muslim, half Orthodox, and with a Jewish population as well. So we had one of the people in our group was a Jewish person, and also said very positive things about how each of these groups are working together. And in fact, it's protocol whenever they get together in any kind of holidays. They all go to each other's holidays. So the mufti or the imam and the rabbi will come to the Orthodox holidays. The archbishop will come to the Muslim or Jewish holidays. It was really interesting. And we got a chance to also go into the mosque, and the imam greeted us there. Wonderful man, very nice. It was really an incredible experience and very welcoming. And then he was trying to shuffle us out of there because he goes, "You need to go see my friend, the priest in the Orthodox Church." Mm-hmm. And the priest was calling him, say, "Hey, where are your people?" So they were communicating all the time. And then the priest came in and he welcomed us there at the church as well. And to me, he basically said, "Yeah, he's my friend, he's my buddy." It's sort of the way it came out. And they all work very well together. So it's really a model of how they have respect for each other. They have over 160 different nationalities and so forth. And we saw this in the small town village Titusha where I went. Lots of different nationalities, but everybody's there's mutual respect, regardless of religion, culture, wherever you're coming from. There's that mutual respect that I found to be really interesting. In fact, they work on it and they emphasize it.
We got a chance to visit this government organization called the Social Cabinet, which I don't know of existing in the United States. It's a cabinet made up of, there is a small business representative, NGO representative, healthcare representative, education representative, banking representative, government. And it's a government organization funded by the law that created it annually, so they don't have to worry about if their funding will be in that area. And two of those people both had been on CCI trips in their
One
own.
specifically said CCI made my business successful and pointed to that. When we flew into Kazan, and by the way, the airport was really terrific. They greeted us there. We had wonderful CCI alumni as well, who again opened up everything to us. And so Svetlana drove us down to a place called Titusha, where my relatives were from one side of the family. I had one side of the family who was very poor, and another side of the family that was quite entrepreneurial and did very well, and this was that side of the family. So, but I was there 12 years ago, and as I mentioned previously, it took 4 hours 12 years ago to get there. We made it in an hour and 20 minutes or so on absolutely new roads. It was beautiful. Really gorgeous landscapes. I mean, just, all the things you hear about Russia, the landscape, and it's there. It's beautiful.
What was your overnight train like?
Long. Oh, well, this is also context I have to give you. During the Soviet times, it was pretty bad. I mean, you didn't want to go to the bathroom in those places. It wasn't a good experience. This was a great experience. And I must say that the new trains, clean bathrooms, polite staff, great food, all the way around. I thought it was a great experience, other than being a very long ride, because we got up at 3 in the morning or 3:30. And it was a quick drive from our hotel.
We went to Krasnodar, which is in the Caucasus, couple hours east of the bridge that goes to Crimea. It was a lovely city, maybe about 1.2 million people now, and we got to see the city through the lens of the workplaces in which people spent their time. I think all of us were struck by the extraordinary advantage that we had of being connected with CCI, but also being hosted by the Rotary Club of Krasnodar, which for a week, all day long, took us to just a vast variety of different workplaces where we spoke, mostly through our wonderful translator, Yana, with all kinds of Russians. So we were struck by a real extraordinary variety of people.
Staying with the host family, which was the most delightful family I could have imagined, particularly their 11-year-old daughter, who greeted me at the door when I was brought home from the airport, and could not have been more exuberant and eager to meet somebody from the United States. And so from that point on, my entire visit there was just wonderful. But more generally, Krasnodar is a very beautiful city, and keeping in mind that really we're talking a country with a history of 20 years, because 20 years ago, the country had come out of 10 years of economic collapse, and before that, 80 years of despotism that frustrated and repressed creativity, etc. So it's amazing to see how much progress they've made in just 20 years, and by that I mean in upgrading the city, so to speak. So Krasnodar was quite developed, in my opinion. The people were genuinely interested in us and interested in their city, not to sell themselves, but just to share what they know and what they've experienced and help us to understand better. So I think one thing that Americans really need to keep in mind is context, and that is so often forgotten. Any bad road that somebody might point out in Russia, I can take you directly to a road that's as bad or worse in the United States, for example. Any criticism we can make, I can find something identical to the United States or Germany or Britain. So I think everyone always needs to keep in mind context, but in context and keeping that in mind, we need to recall and recognize how far Russia has come in only 20 years to raise their country up to the level of a modern Western European country, in my opinion.
That the average salary in Russia is really low. And for the elderly, it's god-awful. The economists we talked to said the average now pension is like $400 a month. But the majority of pensioners are still making between $200 and $250 a month. I don't know if you guys can grasp how little that is. Just one thing I want to add. I didn't mention this, and I need to. The hospitality was excellent, just wonderful. They were very warm, dear people to us, and they treated us very well.
And as well, I did want to mention, we walked down Krasnaya Street, which is a very famous and long street in Krasnodar city, and beautiful. I mean, and it was on a Sunday, so the weekends, it's closed for cars. It's just a pedestrian walk, and it's beautiful. Architecture is beautiful. It's a mixture of Soviet and Russian imperial type of architecture. And I really enjoyed it. Yes, there are some challenges in every other city, whether it's in Russia or in any other country. But they're only 20 plus years old. But yes, they lost 10 years, Russia, because of what happened in the 1990s. I think they'll be just fine.
So Americans need to stop torturing people through sanctions, and need to begin genuinely caring about peace. Nuclear war was always a possibility during the Cold War, not because of necessarily aggressions, but because of accidents. We almost had nuclear disaster because of accidents during the Cold War. Why do we want to return to that now by heightening tensions with a country that has no ability to be aggressive against us in any way? Anyway, I won't say anything more politically, but they are wonderful people. It was a wonderful trip, and I thank you very much, CCI, for letting me do that.
The three of us went to Kungur, which is about an hour south of Perm and just west of the base of the Ural Mountains. The people that live there have a lot of pride in Russia, being Russian, and they have a lot of pride in their town, as Sharon told us all before we came that would be the case. And we were so impressed with the students there. They were well-mannered, they were well-dressed, they were thoughtful. There were two young people that led us around the school, and we toured it. They showed us the pictures and the names of all the teachers and which ones they had, and the teachers had won the awards. They were so proud of their faculty. They showed us to another board of the outstanding alumni and where they were in university now. They said that they felt lucky to be able to have their school, to be a part of the school. And it really struck me how they felt glad to be there, that they enjoyed studying, and that they really understood how important education was to them. From the moment we arrived, we had photographers every minute of the day. The first day we had 2 photographers. And they did articles in the paper, but there was a TV crew. They did a news segment on us, and it was I don't know everything that they said in it because it's still in Russian and I'm having it translated. But we made the news. It was a big deal that we were there. And we went to another school, and which was not a premier elite school. But the kids were so nice, and they stood up when we walked into the room, and they really wanted us to be there. And so I told them I was on social media, and that if they wanted to follow me on Facebook or whatever. So they said, Instagram, are on Instagram? I said, yes. And so I've gotten lots of messages from these kids on Instagram. So I have several followers that are Russian. Yeah, it was really, really a wonderful experience.
And in terms of similarities, though, all the teenagers are plugged into their phones. They're all walking around like our teenagers walk around, but it just didn't feel frenetic somehow. It didn't feel as loud. It didn't feel belligerent like I see a lot. That's right, I say that a lot of kids in the U.S. are ADD. Like, I just didn't get that ADD feel around me. It was just calmer. All right, so and then a few other differences, though. Their class sizes were in the 20s. Our class sizes are 30s into 40s, so their class sizes are smaller. They don't have truancy problems. They don't talk about gangs. They don't have opioid. At the settlement, there was a link between the school and the library and a music school and the cultural center, and everything was all very close, and the kids do their work in the library afterwards. It was just a real community center kind of feel. And there were 2 really interesting questions that they asked of us that I think we could all ask. It was really interesting. There were others, but these are my 2 favorites. One was, what will you do with the information that you got on the trip? Sort of like what are connections? How are we going to get the information out there, which I think we should all be thinking about as we do this, and it was a really good question. And then the other question was about mainstream media's nonstop anti-Russian news and what can be done about it. So they definitely get the sense that in the U.S. it's nonstop anti-Russia. And the last thing is that we made TV and this newspaper article, and people really get the idea that we need to make peace on earth.
We pull up to this house, and we all had our own bedroom. And again, it was just, we were on the way in from the airport, we're passing log cabins, we're passing dilapidated houses, we're passing forest. It's like, no clue where we're staying. So we pull in, big house, 2 big cars, 3 bedrooms, and we each had our own bedrooms. And it was nice, I think, for all of us to be together. Our hostess would make us breakfast or create all kinds of things that we could eat in the morning. She spoke a little English, but not too much. So she said, would you like to come? So I came into the kitchen. She took out a bottle of Rioja wine, which I haven't had wine the whole time I've been here, except for then. And she and her husband and I sat there with Google Translate for an hour and a half. Yeah, so it was just gracious, loving, affectionate, warm, open. And what I also felt, but I don't speak Russian, is the humor, the laughter, the constant, I feel like, jokes, and just happiness being together and laughing, and just very positive. So I thank you for that opportunity.
This is a country that knows war, so much war, invaders, the fences around, all that protection that's not in our memory in the U.S., but they have known war, so they understand the value of peace, and we really need to look in their eyes and hear their stories to understand why we have to avoid this. Yeah.
I'm going to say one more thing. There were many, I'm hearing from the people who've spoken that Rotary was very involved in your stay. My father happened to be a Rotarian. I lived with a Rotary family in Mexico. I've hosted Rotary kids. But an upsetting story from Ludmilla, who was the guide of Bart and Edward in Perm, was that she is very involved still with Rotary, and that they were sister cities are working with a Rotary in Arkansas for 3 years, doing all kinds of great things for their community. And all of a sudden, the governor of Arkansas got involved and said, I don't want you working with Russia. And I would say to everybody in this room, if you're Rotary, if you're not Rotary, that one of the things that we can do, and I'm planning on getting involved with Rotary when I get back, and I think Kathy might join me, is that we get involved in our local Rotary, which is really a service organization that does so many good things, and get Russia back in the mix. I mean, I really think that's one thing that we can focus on. Yeah.
So we visited Irkutsk, and we had slightly different experiences there because we really had 2 hosts. I was hosted by the department head of the American Studies program of the business school of Irkutsk State University. And my traveling companions were hosted primarily by Rotary. So I'll talk more about my experience, and then they will join in on their experiences. I was met at the airport by my host, and while we were traveling to her home, her entire staff was at her house cooking a homemade Russian meal for me. And we had a feast when we arrived. It was a wonderful time. There were 5 young women who teach English at Irkutsk State University, and we just had a lovely evening. I was surprised even more when I found out after they left that that was the first time they had ever visited the department head's home. It was so important to her that an American was there that she invited her staff for the first time to her home. I thought that was really exceptional. I then spent the next day at the State University talking with their classes, fielding their questions about Americans, asking them questions. Most of their impressions are from either American movies or the materials that they use to study their American Studies program. And they have some unusual opinions. They wanted to know how I dealt with my psychotherapist. And I said, what? They were under the impression that most Americans had psychotherapists, and were quite surprised when I said I didn't have one, and wanted to know why I didn't have one. That's a good point. Anyway, we cleared up that misunderstanding, and life went on. One thing, though, that I'd like to bring to your attention is that there are some second-order impacts from this deteriorating situation between the U.S. and Russia that we never even think about. They used to have about 60 students a year in their American Studies program. Right now, they're down to 8. And that's for 2 reasons from what I could figure out. One is that the Russian government used to subsidize the students to participate in this program, and those subsidies have disappeared. And so the only students who can participate are ones who come from wealthy families, because it costs $12,000 for a 3-year curriculum. And the other thing that is happening is that this curriculum is supported by the University of Maryland, and they seem to be getting less and less interested in dealing with the Russian side. And so whereas they used to have professors come over, they haven't had professors in a number of years. Everything is online. They don't even have anyone come over for the commencement ceremony to give out the diplomas. So that's a really, unfortunate situation. Transitioning on to the Rotary side for a minute, the other second order effect that I've seen from these deteriorating situations between the U.S. and Russia is that the Russian NGOs can't apply for funds from a non-Russian organization. So where in the past Rotary has done some really impressive things in the Irkutsk Lake Baikal area, and I think my colleagues here will discuss them, they can't get that kind of money anymore. And so they have to just rely upon local donors. Fortunately, this region, they have some oligarchs, they have some wealthy people, so they're stepping up to help out. But it changes the situation completely. And then the third thing that I wanted to mention is we had, on first day, on Sunday, we went to Lake Baikal, and on the way back, we stopped at an amazing dacha for dinner. And we had a dinner conversation, which I'm not sure, I understand Russian, so I understood a lot of it, but I'm not sure David and Paul picked up on all of it. The Russians were amongst themselves discussing their ancestry. They were discussing in detail who had ancestors who were exiled to Siberia, who had ancestors that came from other countries and why they came. And I sat there in total amazement because I have never heard a conversation like that in Russia before. Maybe it's just my lack of experience, but I've never heard a conversation. It was a conversation you would hear in America very frequently, describing your ancestry in great detail. So I mentioned this to a couple of people, and lo and behold, my hostess, on her father's side, she's half Czech and half Russian. On her mother's side, she's half Russian and half Tatar. And so there's a lot of complicated ancestry there in Siberia. They're very, very proud of it, and they're very, very open about it. And they claim that they are amongst the most open people in Russia because they've been exiled to Siberia, so they can't be exiled any further.
Yeah, that was common. That was definitely common.
And so with that, I'll pass it on to you.
Another thing we saw a lot of was the history, because we all heard of being sent to Siberia and being a terrible thing. And the first morning we were going to go out to Lake Baikal, and I was all excited to see this beautiful lake. Well, the first stop on the road, 5 miles out of town, we went down a little dirt road, and there's just a little simple sign that said memorial. And we went a little farther, and there was just kind of a forest that had been torn up. This is a memorial to 50,000 people that were buried there and discovered about 20 years ago. They found graves of people that early after that were from all walks of life that were put there after the Red Army won, and anyone that wasn't comfortable with being a communist in the new program was reported by a neighbor or unpopular would end up at this place. So they found bodies 8 deep, 50,000 of them. They've created the beginnings of a monument. There's a few stones engraved, but it's just under construction. Again, not to forget what happened. And I think as Nancy said, the people are very well aware of their history and how they turned on each other through that process. And they're consciously trying to be more tolerant and go forward in a much better way. But that was kind of a sobering moment on our first day. And then we went out to Lake Baikal and saw the museum. We were introduced to the freshwater seals that exist nowhere else in the world. And they're really fat, chubby, happy little seals. So there's a lot of, that was a very, well, we stayed with Vladimir Donskoy, who's an honorary Rotarian, but very much involved with the Rotary Group. The Rotary Group is about 16 people. The head of it's a young man, Dimitri, is about 25 years old. Last year's president was about 30 years old, Alexander. And so that was one thing that surprised me, and maybe a difference. Most Rotary clubs I've been to tend to be a little more senior. And these guys were open, enthusiastic, very fun to be around, as was our host.
We had incredible conversations. One of the points was, you talked about the background and where that people come. We talked about generational differences, something they don't really think about. In our country, we have, the World War II generation, the greatest generation, the baby boomers, the Gen Xers. They don't break it down like that. Somewhat the World War II generation, they feel like that, but the rest of it, they don't have that kind of defined generational thing.
Edward and I, my name's Bart, Edward and I are both military veterans, so that's kind of where our radar was focused for a good part of the visit. And as we landed in Perm, we noticed a whole row of MiG fighter aircraft lined up, which looked like they were all in alert facilities. If you're familiar with those, what those look like, hardened facilities. And they did quite a bit of flying while we were there. So anyway, both of us were pretty keen on learning more about the history of Perm, which didn't open up to the west until about 1990. Before that, it was such a secret city because of all the military production there that no Westerners were allowed anywhere close to Perm during that time. And we learned quite a bit more about the military history and the military production as our visit went on. But as we drove into the city, the airport's about a half an hour away. We stayed in a hotel, very nice hotel right downtown. We noticed a lot of new construction. There were a lot of high-rise apartments, as you would expect. A few single-family homes, but mostly the high-rises that are very common. But there was quite a bit of new construction going on. I'm not sure what all of that was. The roads were in great shape going in. The only bumps we felt on the way in were the trolley tracks.
What the Russian people suffered during World War II is not known at all, or only very little, in the West, including in Ireland, and particularly, I think, in the United States. So maybe back home in Ireland and in Europe especially, and in the United States, we all need to be doing more to educate our own people on what the Russian people suffered, and to some extent, particularly in Europe, what they suffered on Europe's behalf, or on Western Europe's behalf, in stopping Hitler, because I think in Europe, if Russia hadn't done what it did at the expense of 27 million people, we would all be under Nazi control, possibly even still.
The three of us, Barbara, myself, Roseanne, and Sally, went to the capital of Siberia, Novosibirsk. We all were hosted in different homes and have had different experiences, although we were together a lot. One of the first things I want to say, though, is I was here in 1987 and visited Moscow and Leningrad and Kiev, and I am amazed, absolutely amazed at the contrast from 1987 to today. In 1987, my adjectives would have been gray, gloomy, oppressive, even sad. And today on the streets, and especially in Novosibirsk, where we've just come from, it's bright, it's vibrant, and people are excitedly expectant. And it's just such a wonderful change to be aware of.
The next morning, they were going to take a train up to Lake Baikal. But I asked one of them, I said, so what do you think Americans should know about Russia? And without hesitation, they said, it's history. But as was mentioned, the women that we met, and the men, but the entrepreneurial spirit, like what was mentioned, was really quite profound and hopeful. One woman who ran the Women's Entrepreneurial Society, her own group, she said, well, what gives her energy is to help people hear each other from the inside, to help us hear each other from the inside. And I thought, what a profound way of understanding sustaining life and ongoing potential in a community when you have people motivated from their inside full time. And I want to say one thing, because everywhere we went, people, all the people we spoke with said, you are so inspiring to us. We are older women, pensioners from their point of view, and you're out, you're doing this work. That gives us hope. We never thought our lives could be like your lives when we're your age. And so I think we thought that was a special gift that we gave to them, that we as older women can really make a difference.
The woman who came, she and I walked out together to go to lunch, and she asked me, where are you from? And I said, Dallas, Texas. Her face lit up, and she said, Peacemakers, 2007. I said, yes, I helped plan that conference. She said, I was there. I was head of the delegation from Novosibirsk, and we, of course, embraced and hugged and kissed and exclaimed, and we're so excited to see each other.
I want to tell you about my hostess. She's a woman, 51 years old. She had, I have 540 square feet in my apartment at home, and hers was smaller. She spoke English. She gave me her bed, which was a pull-out sofa in the general room, and she slept on an excruciating-looking cot in the kitchen. I feel great gratitude toward her. But she also is an opera singer with a glorious voice, and she would sing me off in the morning with Somewhere Over the Rainbow or something wonderful like that. The thing about myself, I think, which surprised people most was when I would have to give an introduction about myself, I would say that I'm a protester, that I go on the streets. And there was real horror that anybody would do such a thing, especially an old lady. And they really, I don't think they ever quite understood why I find that very important and something that I'm supposed to do and satisfying. I want to tell you about two people whom we met. Novosibirsk, as far as I know, is full of fabulous entrepreneurial women. Yes. One we met is trained as a physicist. She started a business with, I think, her husband, something to do with astronaut training. And as a result, over a number of years, that has grown and grown. And she now took us to a business incubator where there is a competition to have office space in this very modern, elegant space, and the services of an office if you are working on some sort of a business project. The other person whom I met that I want to tell you about, or whom we met, is male, even with all these fabulous women. An attorney who specializes in business law. He only works privately, and he tries to help individuals and families start businesses, and he also helps them work their way through the rules, And when I asked him specifically, he said yes, that he did help these families try to avoid taxes, because that's something, of course, which lawyers do in the United States. But the most interesting thing that he said was that he does not believe that there will be an atomic nuclear conflagration in the world. And the reason that he believes that is that it will not be to the advantage of those in the world who want more money. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hello. Kathy and Renee and I went to Kaliningrad. Kathy and I adopted 3 Russian children from Kaliningrad 25 years ago. So part of the reason we chose to go to Kaliningrad was to encounter, to meet with and talk with our children's birth families, which we did. And that was a very moving and wonderful experience.
We went southwest to a town that was a half a mile from the Poland border to meet with one of the birth families of our children.
Until the sanctions went into effect, there was a lot of cross-border travel for salami and cheeses and that sort of thing. And you probably already heard the story that more and more Russian farmers now are making Russian cheese to replace the French and Italian cheeses that were available in the past. So on a lighter note, I just want to get this in, Peter. We had Galina's husband drove us nonstop, but he couldn't speak any English. A few words, but hardly any.
He could understand it, he just couldn't speak it.
He could understand some of it.
Some of it.
Former Army officer, former policeman, and former part-time KGB worker too. So the guy had been around. Security, yeah. And he drove a Russian Jeep, and he informed me that the Russians certainly did invent the Jeep after all. And he made me to drive the Jeep around a little bit. So
it was huge, an OAS Patriot, and if it was a Jeep, it was a very fancy SUV, giant,
think Russian Escalade.
Yeah.
But anyway, the guy had a great sense of humor. And he was telling anecdotes. He'd say, Galina, anecdote. And she would have to translate.
But what he meant was joke.
Mid-joke. His jokes were not funny at all, but they almost all started with something like a Russian, an American, and a Swede were on an island together. It just went downhill from there. But the joy that he had in sharing his stories with us was heartwarming and touching, and we enjoyed that very much. And I wanted to make the point that CCI is not about Republicans and Democrats. It's not about conservatives. It's not about liberals. It's about simply reducing tensions between countries, improving geopolitical relations, and having fun while you're at it too.
I want to talk about public transportation. Kaliningrad used to have trams that ran on rails, but they had I don't know if Standard Oil had hit them too, but they had pretty much gotten rid of all of them except for there was just one line left, which I did not write on. But they have a very comprehensive public transportation system consisting of buses and minivans, and all the buses and minivans say where they go on the side of they give some of the major stops so that people could pretty much tell what the route was on the side of the window, and so you'd get onto this little minivan, and I didn't know the first time I got on it you're supposed to close the door when if you're the last person on. So I came on and I'm like fumbling for coins and everything, and people keep telling me something, and I don't know what it is, and I sit down and somebody does one of these things, and they go and they close the door, and there was a kid behind me, and he goes, I think they were trying to tell you to close the door. You're supposed to close the door when you come on. Okay.
5 of us went to Sergey Posad, which is about an hour on the train to the north of Moscow. It's a city of about 100 to 110,000 people, and the center of town is a monastery. The Lavra of Sergey Posad. And the other major lavra in Russia is the one right outside the window here, the Nevsky Lavra. There are several, of course, but those are 2 major ones. And so anyway, it's also clearly a center of tourism as well. So the vibe of the town, especially when you get off the train. Very good rail traffic there, several trains a day, as well as the buses that leave right outside the Cosmos. It's a very strong tourist vibe, very clean, especially when you get to the rail station. And when you look out, a lot of places you go to and you see whatever you're going to see in real life, and it's smaller, not as impressive. And this is the exact opposite. Sergey Posad, the monastery, is even larger than you thought. It just pops out of the landscape, and it's absolutely beautiful. Well kept, clean, very nice. Even if you have no interest in Orthodoxy at all, it's a wonderful place to cultural visit.
So that night we had a wonderful reception, and we met maybe 15 of them were there, and we ate much more than we needed it, and drank also a lot. And she just was so generous again. She has a big house, and we each had our bedroom, and so we were very comfortable in the house.
Federal government now wants to double organic production in Russia, and there is money available to do that, and it's fairly hefty sums. They're making grants available to new farmers and to family farmers, and for organic. However, after talking about organic for a few hours, it became obvious to us that they don't have our concept of organic agriculture. What they have is what we call organic by default. The farmers who can't afford chemicals are organic by default. They grow good vegetables, but to develop what I believe the government is talking about as organic agriculture, they need very serious help. There is no funding for organic research. Well, there's no funding for organic research in the United States either, but they are where we were 40 years ago. We have made incredible strides. In fact, one of the professors we talked with said that you are our heroes. Your organic farmers are our heroes because you've come so far in 40 years. So we met with 3 farmers, 2 PhDs and a lawyer, former, all of them out of their original careers and going into farming. We met with the director of the vocational ag school and the director of the university.
Just in general, overall, it seemed much more like the United States than, say, unlike the United States. Barnaul, for me, was just, I would call it roughly, and it's obviously very rough, imprecise, imperfect comparison, sort of like the equivalent of Middle America, if you will, a moderate size country, city, rather, in Middle America, if you will, and just, again, infrastructure, people, everyday rhythm of life from what I could pick up. Just things seemed relatively sound, smooth, prosperous. People very overwhelming, very happy and open to see us and meet with us especially.
The city we went to, Barnaul, looked like an American city to me.
Yes.
One thing that struck me is I ask a lot about politics, Putin, Trump, communism, and it seemed like if they were 50 and below, they didn't even know what I was talking about. They had no opinion on politics. They didn't really care. They think, Trump's Trump and Putin's Putin, and we're worried about families and businesses and get along with our life, and they seem to be less interested than the average American, based on it. Rotary, we went to a Rotary meeting, and it was more of a social dinner, asking us lots of questions, and very friendly, young, very young. Average age of Rotary here seems to be younger than it is in the United States. Very business focused, very curious about the United States.
Left to their own wits, they're just like people in the West. Prosperity and continuous improvement has really dramatically improved the economy here.
Crimea. It's a very special place in Russia. They're aware that they've undergone a challenging 5 years, shifting an entire legal system from Ukraine to Russia, new regulations, new educational standards, new taxes. So they were candid about this. It's been tough, challenging, but they feel they've benefited from the change. Things work better, things are on the upswing. There was optimism about that. They are also very candid about sanctions. They're the hardest hit area in Russia by sanctions. Credit cards don't work there. ATM machines don't pop out rubles for you. Tourism is a big part of their economy that's died off as far as international tourism. They used to have hundreds of calls of cruise boats there, Yalta, Sevastopol, now none. They have almost no foreign tourists. Big German tourist groups don't arrive there anymore. They miss that. We visited a university in Simferopol, and they were badly hit by losing international contacts. All these student exchanges had now dried up, particularly with European countries, where there was a lot of support money involved. But they mentioned too, University of Wisconsin had a Russian language program with them. That's now gone. Difficult for students to come. Plus, they really feel the image in the U.S. press is so negative. They really are aware of that.
And the other interesting thing for us to observe was that they were very keen to prove to us that the referendum was legal, that it was done under the Constitution of the Autonomous Republic of Ukraine. It is not something that was totally contrived by the people of Crimea at the insistence or the indirect support of Russia. At least they were telling us, they were showing us official documents, stamped documents. Here's the permission that we got to have the referendum and so forth, which was, again, intending to overcome the sense of isolation that they felt because the world is treating them as being somebody to be excluded, to build walls around. But they said what we were doing was perfectly legal, and why does the world not understand that we acted in a very proper way?
But I guess for me it was the human stories. It was really touching how family had to break up, and half of the family would move to Ukraine and half of the family would stay here. Mothers lost their children to Ukraine, or children, lost their parents. It was really touching, and there were lots and lots of stories like that. And just the amount of construction, I've never seen anything done on that scale, at least in this country. It's very impressive. People are happy. People are not angry about the sanctions. They're we're fine, They were curious why people does not recognize them and their choice, but the spirit there is incredible. It's unbelievable. But we've seen, for example, a mosque that's being built that will be the biggest in Europe. And there were many of them built around. I saw several new mosques. We've driven through towns where Tatars primarily live, and they have nice houses. I think they live just like everyone else there. And people have friends who are Tatars. There's no, I think it's all politicized, the whole.
I want to just back up slightly on a point that Dennis made, which is the last 5 years have been tremendous transition for people here. Everyone here knows about the events of 2014 that came after that. But for many of the older people that we met with, these are people who have now lived in 3 countries. These are people who lived in, their country was the Soviet Union. Then their country was Ukraine. Now their country is Russia. So in fact, there's quite a broad swath of outlook and opinion on many geopolitical issues. But clearly also, as Dennis mentioned, it all comes back to today, where we go from here. We have the situation that we do, and it's quite difficult right now under these conditions for particularly young people in Crimea going forward. And when policy changes happen is anybody's guess. We were asked, again, what do you think? When is it going to change? When is it going to change? And not being close to the government or anything, we had no answer to that. But we do see, there's obviously positive signs. But that was palpable.
I got to visit in Yekaterinburg. And I can't emphasize enough the lovely hospitality, the amount of people, like I said before, who had children who did exchanges in the United States, and I did an exchange when I was in college too. I mean, it opens up a world, and they spoke English. They were able to relate to me in my language, and I couldn't do the same. with them, and just outstanding people, loving people, welcoming people, and I immediately felt at ease with them. We were invited to someone's home where we were welcomed as family and left as family. It's incredible. You just meet someone, you're strangers one day and truly you're family the next. As an Orthodox Christian and someone who has seen the Soviet Union, I was here in 1989, and to see the blossoming, the flowering, the spiritual flowering of Russia. And people, when I told people, my family, my friends, that I was going to Siberia, the first thing they think of is the Gulag. Well, nothing is further from the truth. Incredible. It was skyscrapers and amazing restaurants, fashionable people, fancy cars, gorgeous homes. I'll close with this. I was able to visit the church on the spilled blood, the site of the imperial family's martyrdom, and in orthodoxy for me, it's like a Mecca. It was like a New Jerusalem. So that was, I can't describe being there. And I was able to return with a friend of mine, Dr. Slava Tomashov, who is a university professor both in Ekaterinburg and in the United States. And he was lovely enough to accompany me back a second time, where I was given a private tour of the inside of the spilled church. So, for someone who saw the Soviet Union, the darkness, the drab, the fear, I see light, I see hope, I see Russia returning to what is truly important. And it's not the fancy cars and the accessibility of Western goods, but in the soul of their faith. So I want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity.
For me, it was a historical journey that the residents were very, very interested in. And they were, even though I could speak very, very little Russian, the Russian that I could speak really impressed them. I actually did get an adoption offer. The people that we met with from the Special Olympics Committee, 2 of them said, I said, well, I am up for adoption if anyone wants to keep me. And they said, we might want to, but I don't know if our dog is kind of jealous. And it was just really interesting to be able to have that social gathering experience. I had a really great time, both as a historical researcher, seeing the church on blood, getting a yama, and then also the sociological aspect of it.
Uf is about 3 hours by plane from here, the foothills of the Urals, east. So it's a 2-hour time difference. Basically, this woman, Alla, is, because the government doesn't help small businesses, she put together an organization, association of women business people. So these are small businesses. So I met 9 women in different businesses. I got to go to a tiny ad agency. And my host family, where I lived, she and 2 other women started a private school.
Visited Orenburg. It's in the Urals, separating Asia and Europe. It's a modern city. People are friendly. Lots of old and new reconstruction. People are very warm.